Great. So for this question, the best way to understand is through a graph, because what he's asking is uh, the possible outcomes for this policy. Okay, and if we have the axis, if this is the equilibrium, if this shows the price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis, then in the past, um, let's say this is our initial demand curve, and this is our initial supply curve. And then with red, we represent the supply and demand curve after the restriction. And because he said after the restriction, they put a hard limit on how many wineries could make the wine with this label. So that limits the supply at each price level. That means the supply will be shifted to the left. So that's my new supply curve. And for the demand, because as specified in the question, the demand should also increase because consumers know that they're getting a better quality product. And what that means is at each price, at all prices, consumers are willing to purchase more. So that means the demand curve is shift to the right. So you see that this will be the new equilibrium. Let's call it E1. And let's call the previous equilibrium before the policy as E0. So comparing E1 and E0, we see that it's obvious that the equilibrium price has increased. And about equilibrium quantity, it's actually not quite clear whether this equilibrium quantity and which equilibrium quantity is larger. So it's possible that if the S1 shifts in like slightly less, then it's possible that the equilibrium price, the equilibrium quantity becomes higher. But if the supply curve shifts in a little bit more, so let's say if it's actually here, it moves a little bit further to the left, then this will be the new equilibrium quantity. And the Q1 prime will actually be smaller than Q0. So for the equilibrium quantity, it could either so if it's the case in red, then we know that the equilibrium quantity decreases. But if it's in yellow, the equilibrium quantity will increase. Sorry, if it's in red, the equilibrium quantity increases, and if it's in yellow, in the case in yellow, then the equilibrium price quantity decreases. So equilibrium price has unambiguous movement, but equilibrium quantity, it depends on the size of the shift. That's why both F and G could be correct. This corresponds to the case F, and the yellow case corresponds to case G. I see. I got it. Yeah, but again, because we didn't know about the exact sizes of the shift, so the size about quantity could also be slightly different, right? Because we don't know the exact amount. So that adds to the ambiguity of the results. Okay, so I think that answers your question. And what else? You can directly ask me or type down in the box. Second free response question from the same second free response question? Do you mean a multiple choice question or the calculation question? Oh, okay, sure. The second calculation question, this should be quite similar to the midterm, right? So let's take a look at it. So the following three graphs depict a consumer's indifference curves and optimal consumption bundles under a variety of different budget sets. In this question, your graphs need not to be scale, but you must clearly label at least 3 points on each curve. So for part A, what is the consumer's marginal rate of substitution at the consumption point 12.4? Okay, so first let's take a look at these graphs respectively. So for graph 1, we see 3 parallel indifference curves, and for those straight lines, they're actually budget lines. We could see that for the budget lines, the slopes remains the same. It's just the intercept becomes different. So that means people's income grows as we move from the inner line to the outer line. Keeping the price ratio constant. And for the second graph, the total income remains at 80, and we see that for the budget line, the price of Y also remains the same at 5, but the price for good X actually is changing. So in the innermost budget line, price for good X is $10 per unit, and then it becomes $5 per unit, and then it further decreases to $2 per unit. That's why the purchase of X is shifting out on the horizontal axis, but the purchase of good Y remains the same because the price of Y remains a price equal to 5. But along all these budget lines, we see the total income is constant, it's at $80. And it also reaches like different utility levels. And for the third graph, we see that it reaches the utility level of U equals to 8. And for the budget lines, the price for y remains the same, but the price for x is different at px equals to 10, equals to 5, and equals to 2. And we also see that the total expenditure is changing. So for this graph, it's just different budget line that reaches the same utility level. Okay, so let's move on to the first question. What is the consumer's marginal rate of substitution at the consumption point? 12.4. So to calculate the marginal rate of substitution, we should know the slope of the indifference curve. And from graph 1, we know that because these are the budget lines and the indifference curves are tangent to each other, so the slope of the indifference curve is actually the slope of the budget line, which is also the marginal rate of transformation. So for this question, Q2 for part A, marginal rate of substitution is equals to marginal rate of transformation, which is the price ratio. And we know that the price of good X and price of good Y are both 5. That means the marginal rate of transformation is -1. So we see that at the point of 12.4, the marginal rate of substitution is -1. And then moving on to part B, are good X and good Y substitutes, complements, or neither? Explain. So whether X and Y are substitutes or complements depends on if Px increases or decreases, how the consumption of Y changes. So if under the premise that holding income constant or holding endowment constant, if price of X changes, how Y changes. Oh, sorry. No. Let's ignore this part. So for this graph, take a look at graph 2. So graph 2, Py remains the constant. And as Px changes from 10 to 2, we could see that as Px changes from 10 to 2, that is for this graph. Okay, so this is Px equals to 10, and this is Px equals to 2. We see that the consumption of good Y, it used to be 8, and then it becomes 2. Y changes. Is to 2. And additionally, you can see that X changes from 4 to 35. So that means if Px holding income constant, if Px increases, the consumption of X will increase, but the consumption of Y will decrease. So that means X and Y are substitutes to each other. And some additional comments. If as px increases, this should be decrease. Extra comments. If px decreases, the consumption of x increase, but the consumption of y also increases, and that means x and y are complements. Okay, but that is not our case here according to our graph 2. So that's for part B. If you don't have any questions, I'll move on to part C. For part C, on a graph, draw the consumer's angle curve or income elasticity curve for good x when px equals to 5 and py equals to 5. Then tell us if x is a normal good or an inferior good. Explain. So for this angle curve, we need to study the relationship between I and x. And that's basically tells us if I increases, how, or not really if, but as I increases, as income I increases, how does consumption x changes? So for our graph, we should put, we put income on the horizontal axis. That is our endowment. And we put the consumption x on the y-axis. Because we want to keep px and py equals to 5. That means we want to use graph 1, where all the budget lines have the same price ratios. So for so let me briefly draw graph 1 here. So for graph 1, it's 3 indifference curves and 3 parallel budget lines. If I call these lines A, B, C, at those tangent points with the indifference curves, then at point A, we know that income is 40 and the consumption of X is 6, I think. Okay. And then at point B, the total income is 80 and the consumption of X is 12. Next, at point C, the total income is 160. And the consumption of X is 24. Okay, so we can just reflect this information on our indifference curves by connecting the dots representing ABC. So here when X equals to 6, I equals to 40, and if it's doubled to 12, income doubled to 80, and if it's doubled again to 24, income is doubled. So we have these dots A, B, and C. And by connecting these dots, that will be a little bit off, but connecting these are the angle curves being asked. And about whether it's a normal good, a normal good is something you consume more if your income is increased. So it's more consumption if you have higher income. And in our case, as our income increases, our consumption of good acts actually increases. That's why it is a normal good. Okay, so that is for part C. And for part C, I think the translation from this graph to this table is the key. And the next step is just to represent these dots on the axis. I think that's pretty straightforward, but the point is to do this translation from graph to this table. And then for part D, on a graph, draw the consumer's uncompensated demand curve for X when Px equals to 5 and I equals to 80. So we need to draw the demand curve for Py equals to 5 and I equals to 80. So for the demand curve, that means we need to draw the demand for X. The demand for X should just be if Px equals to certain values, how many X consumption will you have? So to draw the demand curve, we first need to label the axis. And we put price of X on the vertical axis and the unit consumption of good X on the horizontal axis. Because we want to hold income at 80 and hold the price of Y to be constant. We will need to refer to graph 2. I call this upper right one as graph 2. Upper right graph. As graph 2. Okay. And for graph 2, we can see the income is held at 80 and the price of Y is fixed at 5. But for that graph, let's call this graph these 3 tangent points again as A, B, C. And then for this table, A, B, C, we check the values of X and Px. We see that at point A, the price of X is 10, and the consumption of X is 4. Okay, and then for point B, the price of good X is 5, and the consumption of good X is 12. And at point C, the price of good X is 2, and the consumption of good X is 35. So what we'll need to do is we draw these points on this graph. So for point A, X equals to 4, and Px equals to 10. So roughly here. I'll leave more space for the following dot. So when price equals to 10, this is my demand. And when price equals to 5, my demand becomes 12. A little bit here left. And when price drops to 2, my demand becomes 35. Well, it's hard to draw to the scale. So this corresponds to point A, point B, and point C. And I just draw a curve that connects these 3 points. So again, I think the key point is to choose the correct graph 2, and then translate to this table, and then reflect these points on this px axis. So I think that's so much for part D. And then moving on to part E. On the graph above, draw the consumer's compensated demand curve for X. Compensated. So for compensated demand, it means to reach the previous utility, the old utility, under the new price ratios. And here the old utility is just u xy equals to 8. So coming back to the graphs, we see that only the last graph, the one to the lower left, like all of these budgets leads to the same utility level. So that means we will need to use the lower left graph. I'll use the table first. I'll find out the table first. This point 1, 2. So again, we have these tangent points A, B, C, and we need to do that translation again. So we could see that at point A, I will use XC as the compensated demand, and then the price of X. And we know that so for point A, the price of X is 10, and the compensated demand, that is at Px equals to 10, to reach the utility of 8, the compensated demand is 8. And then moving to point B, if price decreases to 5, then the compensated demand to reach U equals to 8 will be 12. And then at point C, the price of X becomes 2, and the compensated demand becomes 25. So we need to mark 8, 12, and 25 in the previous demand curve. So that gives us, I'll use a red line. So if Px equals to 10, the compensated consumption is actually 8. So it's at this point, I'll use A prime to represent these points. And then at B prime, it's still 12.5. But at C, the compensated demand is actually 25, so it's less than 35. And we connect these 3 points. So the red one is the compensated demand. And the black one, the black line, is the uncompensated demand. Okay, hopefully so far everything is clear. So that's for part E. Then for part F, is the compensated demand curve more or less elastic than the uncompensated demand? Explain why using substitution. And could you explain? Yes, I am going to explain the difference between compensated and uncompensated demand. So for part F, that's actually asking the question. So our conclusion is because uncompensated demand includes 2 parts that are of the same sign, but compensated demand only includes 1 part, that is the substitution effect. So uncompensated demand is more responsive than compensated demand when price changes. So our conclusion is uncompensated demand is more elastic. Compensated demand is less elastic. Yeah, I think that's the answer to this question. And then for part G, suppose Px changes from 5 to 2 when Py equals to 5 and I equals to 80. What is the substitution effect, income effect, and total effect of the price change on the consumption of good X and good Y? For part G, when Px and Py Px changes from 5 to 2, Py is held constant at 5, and income is constant at 80. So we need to go back to, so first we should choose which graph we're going to look at. Okay, so if price of good X changes from 5 to 2, that means if price of good X changes, but the price of good Y remains constant and income remains constant, that leads to the upper right graph. That depicts this whole change, because the upper right graph, which I call graph 2, its price of good X changes and the price of good Y is held constant, and income is also held constant at 80. So that is the graph we want. And we will see that when price equals to 5, price of good X equals to 5, price of good Y is 5, and I equals to 80, the optimal consumption. Let's call this the old bundle, Q0, before the change, it equals to 12.4. So this is the consumption of good X, and this is the consumption of good Y. And then after the change, when price equals to 2, price of good X equals to 2, price of good Y equals to 5, and the total income is still held at 80. Now let's call this optimal, the new optimal bundle. Optimal bundle, let's call it Q1 as after the change, and that should be 35 and 2. Okay, because it's asking for the substitution effect. Substitution effect, as we said before, we should need to find the compensated bundle. And the compensated bundle is if we want to reach the new utility, we want to reach the old utility at the new price ratios, what is our consumption bundle? That is called the compensated bundle. Okay, so that's the bundle that reaches old utility at new prices. And we know that the old utility is just utility at the old optimal. And at the old optimal, Q0 equals to 12.4 on graph 2, we see that the utility is equals to 8 from graph 2, which is the upper right graph. And then to find the compensated bundle, let's call it QC, we need to find a bundle that reaches U equals to 8 and Px equals to 2 and Py equals to 5. It needs to meet such requirements. Okay, because this is the new price after the price change, and this is the old utility. So we need to find QC such that these conditions are satisfied. So the point that satisfies these conditions are in graph 3, the lower left graph. And we see that QC actually equals to 25 and 2. So to find the substitution effect, we need to find the compensated bundle. Now we already find this compensated bundle. And then the substitution effect is just the compensated bundle minus the original, the old optimum. So it's 25.2 minus 12.4. And that gives us 13 negative 2. So this is the substitution effect. And then for the income effect, it is defined as the new optimum minus the compensated bundle. And we know that the new optimum is 35.2 and the compensated bundle is 25.2. So that gives us 10.0. You just minus 25, you just deduct 25 from 35 and deduct 2 from 2. That's why we have this 10.0 pair. And next for the total effect. Of course, you could just directly add substitution effect and income effect. Plus income effect. And that is adding up 13 and 10, that gives us 23. And adding up -2 to 0, that gives us -2. But alternatively, we can directly use the new optimum minus the previous optimum and get this total effect. And that would give us the same answer because the new optimum is 35.2 and the old optimum is 12.4. So that also gives us 23 -2. So either way, we can get the same answer. And that actually confirms that total effect is the sum of substitution effect plus income effect. So this is for part G. Then moving on to part H. What is the equivalent variation of the price change? Explain. So first we will need to know what is the equivalent variation and how it is calculated. So the EV is the change in income to achieve or to reach the new utility. Utility at old prices. And to calculate EV, it is IE minus I. And the IE is just the income you needed to reach the new utility at old prices. So we already know that the previous income is 80. So the task is to find out IE. And we know that the new optimal bundle, so side note, we say that on the previous slide, we say that Q1 equals to 35 and 2. That is our new optimum, right? So this is our new optimum, and the utility at this new optimum is, let's go back to 35 and 2. The utility is 12 from the upper right graph. Corresponding to the optimal bundle of 35 and 2, the utilities is actually 12. So to reach the new utility, so this is the under Px equals to 2 and Py equals to 5. And IE is just how much you need to pay if how much income to achieve U equals to 12, but at old prices where Px equals to 5 and Py equals to 5, because the old price is when price of x equals to 5. No. Can you hear me now? I'm not muted. Hello? Oh, okay. So you can constantly hear me, right? I've never muted myself. Hey, Caitlin? Sorry. Um, Caitlin. Okay, great. So our next goal is to find how much income we need to reach the utility of 12 at price of x equals to 5 and price of y equals to 5. So we just look at all these graphs that can reach the utility of 12 at px equals to 5 and py equals to 5. And that's what we find. So in graph 1, the uppermost optimal bundle at 12 and at 25 and 8, we see that px equals to py equals to 5 and u equals to 12, and we see that the budget line for this optimal bundle is 5x plus 5y equals to 160. That means we will need the income level 160 to reach u equals to 12 and px equals to 5 and py equals to 5. So we find this point in graph 1, and we find that the income, the IE, is actually 160. So IE is 160. And previously, at the original optimum at 35 and 2, we could find that the I is 80 because we use the upper right graph and find the budget line, and we see that the budget is 2x plus 5y equals to 80, because this is from 2x plus 5y equals to 80 at the upper right graph. So we already know I equals to 80, and we also know that IE equals to 160. So in this way, we could calculate our equivalent variation. That is $80. So that's the answer to part H. And part I, do you expect the compensating variation of the price change to be larger or smaller in size, in magnitude than the equivalent variation? Explain. So we already draw the uncompensated, like if you go back to this graph, we already draw the uncompensated demand curve and the compensated demand curve. Here I will just redraw it and also add the new line after the price change. So I'll use this. as uncompensated. And red line as the compensated. So this is the old one. Because we know that before the price change, our consumption will be 235. Yeah, let's not draw these graphs. So for the uncompensated curve, we know that before the price change, our consumption is when P equals to 2, our uncompensated 1 consumption is 35. And when price increases to 5, our consumption of good X becomes 12. So these 2 points just corresponds to the Q. This is the Q1. Sorry, this is the Q0. So these 2 points just correspond deep. So we draw the compensated bundle. So this is after the price change. And this is before the price change. And we say that the compensating variation is the changing area under the compensated demand curve at the old bundle. Sorry. CV. Let's change. An area under the compensated demand curve. So the change under the compensated demand curve I use the red line. So this is the compensated demand curve at the old bundle. And this is the old bundle. So this is the old bundle, and this is how the CV changes, because this is the old bundle. At when price equals to 5, the optimal consumption of X is 12. This is the old bundle. And this is the area change after the price change. And for EV, it's the area under the compensated demand curve. Yes. So the area under the compensated demand curve at the new optimal bundle is just the green shaded area. So this is the EV. Now, if we compare the size of these two areas, we know that the EV is actually larger in size or in magnitude. So I think to highlight, CV is the changing area on their compensated demand curve at old bundle, but EV is the area under compensated demand curve under new bundle. So once we know these differences, we shall be able to find to locate these areas. And also another thing to pay attention to is because this is the demand curve. So on the vertical axis is the price of X, and don't mix it with like the units of Y or something else, because that might be confusing to you. And here, like we only care about the consumption of X, and we care about the price of Y. So that's why we have these different bundles before and after the price change. Yeah, so I think that's the point to this question. And anything else you want me to talk about? Maybe question 3, or you already have some other questions? Okay. Caitlin, do you have any questions? Question 3 on multiple choice. Oxen are commonly used in agriculture to plow fields. Okay. Oxen commonly used in agriculture to plow fields and pay $20 to rent 2 oxen for plowing season. To plow her field, she will be able to plant. Without oxen, produce $30 worth of crops. Another farmer is offered 60 to let them use oxen to plow instead. How once feel necessary enough time to plow both. The economic profit, revenue minus opportunity cost. Yeah, I think Selvin gives I think Selvin already gives the answer to the question. Just need so we just know that equation. Yes. Then shall we move on to calculation question 3? Okay. So question 3, we have a small country that has enough land for 90 identical farms that can grow cotton. Each farm has a marginal cost of this equals to 3Q. And the marginal cost intersects average cost at Q equals to 2/3. Let aggregate demand for cotton be 120 minus 10p. So part A. What ranges for so question 3, part A. For what range of prices will an individual farm produce cotton, and for what range will it shut down? Hint, what's the price at which MC equals to AC? So we know that the firm will continue to produce as long as price is higher than average cost, but it will stop production if price is actually lower than average cost. So we will just need to find out the price at which it will continue to operate. And from the question, we already know that when the marginal cost equals to average cost, Q equals to 2/3. So that gives us, at this point, marginal cost is actually, because we say from the question set out, we know that MC equals to 3 times Q. Then at this point, it should be equal to 3 times 2/3, which is 2. And we know that the price should equal to marginal cost. So at this point, the price should equal to, because marginal cost is 2, we know that the price should also equal to 2. And as long as the price is higher than 2, which means the price is higher than the average cost, the firm will continue to produce. If price is higher than 2, firm produces. But if price goes below 2, then firm will shut down. Okay, so that's the answer for the first question, because you're asked about the price range. And then for part B, what is a farm's individual supply curve taking into account its shutdown condition as a function of price? So basically, it's just asking you what is QF as a function of price. And we already know that if P, yeah, we already know that if P is smaller than 2, firms choose not to produce. So for each firm, the production is 0. But if P is greater or equal to 2, we know that firms will produce such that price equals to marginal cost, because price is the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue should equal to marginal cost. And we already know that the marginal cost equals to 3Q if it produces. So that means Q of S of each firm, it equals to 1/3 of P, it's already making the production decision. So to summarize that, we know that the quantity produced by each firm is equal to 1/3 of price if P is greater or equal to 2, and it equals to 0 if price is lower than 2. So I think that's the answer to the second part. This is the supply curve for each individual firm. And next, moving on to part C, what is the aggregate supply curve as a function of price? And we know that each individual firm has such a lowercase q as production, and we have 90, we have 90 identical firms. So the group production is actually 90 times each firm's production. So that gives us 90 times Q of S. So if P is greater or equal to 2, 1/3 times 90 brings 30 times P. And if P is lower than 2, again, no firm will produce. So in aggregate terms, the total production will also be 0. So this will be the answer to part C. Then for part D, explain why the domestic market equilibrium occurs at P equals to 3 and Q equals to 90. How much cotton does each firm produce in this equilibrium? So we already know that the aggregate demand is Q demand equals to 120 minus 10P, and the aggregate supply is QS equals to 30P if P is greater or equal to 2, and 0 if P is lower than 2. So if we equate, let's say if P is greater or equal to 2, we just equate QS equal to QD and find out the equilibrium price. So it's 120 minus 10P equals to 30P. So that gives us 40P equals to 120. So P star should equal to 3. And plugging that in, the Q star should be equal to 90. And we do find that the equilibrium price is 3, which is greater than 2. And that confirms that this is the correct answer or a feasible answer under this setting. Okay, so it's possible to achieve this equilibrium. So this is a feasible equilibrium. And this is this is the total production, and because we have 90 identical firms, we know that QS is actually 90 is actually the Q star over 90, so each firm will produce 1. Will you be going over any material from the first half of the class? I think for part like for this, because I'm going over the final exam for last year, and for question 2, that's actually the materials we cover in the midterm. So that's kind of a brief review. I've already went through this part, so maybe you can go over my notes, and I'm trying to upload this to some online sources as well. So if you're interested, you can also go back to the video, and maybe if you can't understand some parts of my notes, you can also go back to the video and check it out. Because now I am going through the last question. I forgot how to find the equivalent bundle, and that's all I was wondering about. So the equivalent bundle is the bundle that you reach the old utility at the new price ratios. So yeah, so yeah, I would recommend to like go over my notes for part for question 2, because I just finished that. Is there a clear instruction for the final online? I don't think I haven't checked my email yet. Yeah, maybe I'll ask the professor immediately after the this office hour. We have to wait. I think we'll have to wait for the professor to send the email. Okay, so for Dana's question, maybe if I have extra time, after I finish question 3, I can go briefly go over the parts related to equivalent bundle. But since I just talked about it, I want to focus on the new questions and try to save time for your question, okay? Thank you. So let's continue with question 3, part D. Explain. Okay, we already finished that part. Then for part E, suppose a country operates, suppose the country opens up to trade, where the world price of cotton is 1. Will the country be a net importer or net exporter of cotton, or neither? Because in the country, the domestic price, equilibrium price is 2. Now, if the international price is actually 1, it's just lower than the domestic price, then the country will stop at not really stop, but the country will think it's profitable to directly purchase from like international sources. So that will turn the country into a net importer. And part F, what is the domestic demand, domestic supply, and amount of imports or exports with trade? So if at price equals to 1, we know that because going back to our supply function, if P is smaller than 2, firms will continue to, firms will stop to produce and shut down. So domestic supply will be 0. But domestic demand, because we have the demand function, 120 minus 10 times P. So we plug in P equals to 1, so it's 120 minus 10, which leads to 110 as domestic demand. So the amount of imports or exports, since the domestic demand is greater than domestic supply, we need to import, and the imported amount will be 100 minus 0, which is 110 minus 0, which is 110. So the country will completely depends on imports of cotton in this case, if the international price becomes 1. And moving on, if a farm earns 0 profit, it is indifferent between producing and shutting down. Assume that the farms will produce if they can exactly earn 0 profits. What's the minimum level of tariff or subsidy on imports required to get domestic farms to produce? Is it a tariff or a subsidy? So previously, we know that if P equals to 1, firms will stop to produce. But as long as price increases to 2, then firm will continue to produce. So in order to attract firms to produce, we will need to think of a way to increase the international price from 1 to 2. So the task is to increase import price from 1 to 2. So this will be a tariff because you want, once you import the product, you want to add the price to the initial international price, and that is a tariff. And that tariff, that amount of the tariff will just be $1 per unit, because that will just increase the import price from 1 to 2. Okay, so let's say if tariff equals to 1, then the import price will be 2, and that will attract producers to resume production. So that's the answer for part G. Next, for part H. At this level of tariff or subsidy, what is the domestic price, domestic supply, domestic demand, and imports or exports of cotton? So if we add a tariff of $1, then the tariff, after the tariff, the price becomes 1 plus 1, which is 2. So at price equals to 2, we know that from our supply curve, if price is higher or equal to 2, firms are willing to supply at 30 times P. So now it's 30 times 2. So domestic firms are willing to produce 60 units in total. And for domestic supply, for domestic demand, we say the demand function is 120 minus 10 times P. And now we plug in P equals to 2. So it's 120 minus 20. So that would be 100. So that's our domestic demand. And again, because domestic demand is greater than domestic supply, we still need to import to meet this domestic demand. And that gap is 100 minus 60, which is 40. So we'll need to import 40 units of cotton. So that's for part H. For part I, depict the equilibrium with the tariff or subsidy graphically, clearly label the domestic supply and demand curves, the world price, the domestic price, and the quantities of supply and demand. So this is, I'll just use a new board. This is a little bit tricky because the supply curve is not a continuous one, it's a piecewise one. So first, let's draw and label the axis. We'll put price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. So for the demand curve, it's quite straightforward. It's a downward sloping demand curve. But for supply curve, it's kind of tricky because if price is lower than 2, the quantity produced will remain at 0. But if price rises to 2, that firm will start to supply, beginning at Q equals to 60. And this 60 is just what we have calculated. If price equals to 2, how many units our domestic farmers are willing to produce. And from that on, we have the supply curve as a straight line. So this is our domestic supply. Depict the domestic supply demand curves, the world prices, We know that the world price is actually 1. So I'll just use PW. Domestic price. So after the tax, domestic price becomes 2. And quantities of supply and demand. So we could see that if we keep the price at 2, the domestic supply is 60 and domestic demand will be 100. But if the price ratio, at the initial price of 1, the domestic supply is 0. And the domestic demand is 110. So this is for part I. Then for part J, on your graph, depict producer surplus, consumer surplus, government revenue expenditure, and debt rate loss if there is any. So this will be like the producer surplus and consumer surplus and government revenue after we impose this tariff. So after we impose this tariff, the equilibrium price in the domestic market becomes 2. So we know that for consumer surplus is the area so for consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve, above the equilibrium price, and up to the equilibrium quantity. And here we know that the equilibrium quantity is actually 100 because the domestic suppliers gives them 60 units and they purchase 40 units from the international markets. So for consumer surplus, the black shade is just the area above the price they pay, which is $2, and below their demand function, and up to the units that they could consume, which is 100. Okay, and then for producer surplus, because producers they so I'll just mark this as consumer surplus. But for producer surplus, since at the a price of 2, they're making like their supply curve is here. It's actually actually the producer surplus is 0, so we cannot draw it out on this graph. And for government revenue, because once the government imposed the tariff of $1, sorry, I'll use another color. I'll use blue color. Once they impose the tariff, actually the domestic suppliers are willing to supply, and they only need to import 40 units. So for each unit of import, they could gain $1 as a tariff. That's why in this region, like this area is 40. So this is actually government revenue or government tariff. Government revenue. So for government revenue. Okay, so this is the total surplus after the price change after the tariff is imposed. But before the tariff is imposed, we could see that producers were unwilling to produce, and the domestic consumers will completely rely on importation, and the price is at one. So the consumer surplus used to be this. Let me use a yellow one. So the producer surplus used to be 0, but the consumer surplus used to be this yellow triangle area. Because P equals 1 is the price they pay, and they could consume up to 110 units. So this yellow area used to be the consumer surplus. But after the tariff is imposed, we see that consumer surplus shrinks to this shaded black area, and this blue rectangle goes to government revenue, and these two areas in yellow shade, these two areas, they goes to nowhere. So we call these things deadweight loss. And here is the deadweight loss. It's because after you impose the tax, this part of surplus, they didn't go to anywhere. So that's the deadweight loss from imposing the tariff.